Sciel can be the guiding light as the most potent support on your team, yet also unleash absolute mayhem on your enemies with the highest damage potential in the game by harnessing her dark side. But as the most complex character, fully grasping her abilities is essential to master both aspects. So in this video I'll break down each ability with numbers, synergies and key nuances before ranking them so you can embrace her Twilight nature and unlock her full potential. Let's start with solar skills. Sciel has solar and lunar abilities in line with her Twilight mechanics. Solar skills can apply Foretell to your enemies, while lunar abilities can consume those for increased potency. You also gain a sun or moon charge on using the respective ability types, and once you collect one of each, you enter an empowering Twilight state. Make sure to check out the spreadsheet in the description for numbers on the mechanic and her skills. But now let's actually talk about skills. First off, her starting ability, Focus Foretell. This is her lowest damage ability. Despite the base tooltip claiming it's medium damage, it's actually abysmal damage, equal to a base attack. But it can apply up to 5 Foretell against enemies without any, which is decent early on because Sciel's mechanic is fully reliant on abilities and you shouldn't really base attack ever. So despite the terrible damage, the skill does apply Foretell, which can be turned into 5 AP with her mechanic, and it gives you a sun charge that's necessary to trigger that AP gain and enter Twilight state. While it doesn't look great numerically, it is cheap and you kinda rely on it early on, so C tier, low damage, but it does its job of getting the mechanic going. And then we have Marking Card. For 1 more AP, you deal more than twice as much damage as Focus Foretell and you apply Mark, which is an amazing status effect, and just for being a status effect, it also lets you restore 2 AP once you have the Beneficial Contamination Picture, which you do find relatively early. I do think this is an upgrade to her starting ability in most cases, despite less Foretell applied on a fresh target. The Marking utility makes up for that and may even stay relevant much later into the game. So I'll give it a solid B tier, great skill, but there are much stronger skills later on. Next up we have Bad Omen, her first AoE ability that deals decent damage for its cheap cost of 3. It's slightly less than Marking Card and it doesn't apply Mark, but it applies 4 Foretell to all enemies without any conditions, which is really nice for setting up higher impact skills. With her mechanics, you can completely restore her AP with this ability when used against multiple enemies. If you're not in Twilight and use a lunar skill and then a solar skill, you will gain AP equal to the amount of Foretell applied. And if you use a solar skill followed by a lunar skill, you will gain AP equal to the amount of Foretell consumed. So her mechanic in general is pretty powerful in the sense that it's the only one that restores AP. And with Bad Omen, you can start your Twilight turns with full AP pretty much every time, which is super strong early on when you don't have good sources for AP generation in general. This makes Bad Omen pretty flexible in all kinds of fights. If it's a 1-turn trash battle, it deals decent AoE damage to finish enemies. If you expect a 2-turn fight, it also sets up a buffed lunar skills for turn 2 on all enemies. And for longer battles, it can provide the highest AP gain before your Twilight turn. It's a really nice ability in general with many good uses, but it falls off later into the game, which is why I'll give it a B tier as well. And then we have Searing Bond. This is very similar to Bad Omen. Everything I just said pretty much applies to the skill, but you need burning enemies for it to be AoE. It then deals around 1/3 more damage compared to Bad Omen, but it also costs 1/3 more AP and applies 1 more Foretell, which can be good enough of an upgrade if you apply Burn reliably with something like Luna's Wildfire. That's what I did in my first playthrough and it worked pretty well. I'll put it right next to Bad Omen in B tier. Solid linear increase over a good skill, but its condition makes it slightly less flexible. And then we have Card Weaver, an ability that I really didn't care for when I first saw it. The play again effect is obviously very powerful, but in my mind I had no interest in spreading Foretell from one enemy to others. That just never seemed like something I would want. And the damage that I could get with a free turn to me just didn't seem like it was even worth the 3 AP with how little AP you have early game. And in my defense, the game with its atrocious base descriptions did present it as a low damage skill. So I would naturally assume it will deal less damage than an allegedly medium damage skill like Focus Foretell, which deals terrible damage. So by that logic, it would not be worth it. But the base tooltips are wrong and it actually deals much more damage than Focus Foretell. It's the same as Bad Omen, and with the same cost, getting that damage in with a free turn now looks much more appealing. But it's not just the damage you can squeeze in, and I don't think the Foretell propagation really matters, but Sciel's mechanic benefits her immensely by just using any skill thanks to the lunar or solar charges that she gets. Any skill used means you can expedite her AP gain and her Twilight state, or at least increase the potential Twilight damage bonus, as every charge adds 25%. That on top of all the other turn-start benefits, which includes the natural 1 AP gain, making it more cost-effective and much better in general. There's also the Chation weapon that lets you apply 10 Foretell with any Sun skill at the cost of taking double damage, which is pricey, but with Card Weaver this lets you deal damage and apply 10 Foretell that's spread to all enemies and then play again to immediately consume them for a massively buffed lunar ability before your enemies even take a single turn. So yeah, back then I didn't have the numbers, I didn't see the big picture, but now I do. Card Weaver is amazing, at least until you get Cheetah, then it becomes pretty obsolete. So another B tier for a skill ruined by that Picto. And by the way, if you're wondering about the tooltips you see here, it's a PC mod called Enhanced Game Descriptions by Kim SJD. You can Google it. Just keep in mind that unlike my spreadsheets linked below, the mod doesn't account for QuickTime event perfect input bonuses for skills, and if you're on console, you're stuck with spreadsheets anyway. If you find these useful, please leave a like or comment, I would really appreciate that. And if you enjoyed the video, consider sticking around by subscribing. It's a free way of supporting the channel, and it really makes a big difference. But now back to our skills. Next up we have Spectral Sweep, a rather expensive single target skill that can apply a lot of Foretell with some crit chance. It's 6 to 12 Foretell based on how many hits were criticals to be specific, and 12 would be overkill because Foretell is capped at 10. But that also means you don't need to be at 100% critical strike chance to consistently apply max Foretell, which is nice I guess, but it's still somewhat conditional, and my biggest gripe with this ability is the damage being so low for a single target skill that expensive. With perfect inputs, you're looking at a 3.6 attack power multiplier, which is only 50% more than Bad Omen, for example, a free cost AoE skill. Spectral Sweep is also one of those abilities where you need to hit the QuickTime event or you will be getting less hits, which not only means you will deal way less damage, but also apply way less Foretell. And while I don't think that needing to hit the QuickTime event is a big deal, and I kinda assume perfect inputs in general when comparing skills, it just feels like an unnecessary downside on this skill because you're not being rewarded enough for an ability you can mess up like that. I'll put it into C tier because it can still cap Foretell in one turn, and with up to 6 hits it's at least decent at circumventing the damage cap during a certain period of the game. And then we have Final Path, her most expensive Sun skill. This one applies the maximum of 10 Foretell, no questions asked, and actually has the highest base damage of all of her abilities, with the exception of her third gradient attack. Final Path has a multiplier of 10.5, which is 3 times as much as the previous skill. It can also break and has a full 100% break damage multiplier, so it's good at filling the bar as well. Now, being a Sun skill does mean that it will not get scaled as much as some Moon skills that can consume Foretell for massive multipliers, but the damage of this skill is still quite impressive, especially for a setup ability. It is expensive, but I do believe Final Path deserves its spot in S tier as the apex solar ability that caps Foretell while dealing much more damage than any other Foretell applying skill, with a huge break multiplier and the ability to break on top. And now onto some non-damaging support solar skills. First off, Rush, which, well, applies Rush to all allies for free AP, which I think is a really good buff for better action economy, and with a 3 turn duration, hard to not get value out of this. I mean, you just need to get 1 extra turn out of this one and it already pays for itself, but it's likely to get an extra turn not only for Sciel, but your other allies as well. So just as a baseline skill, you never lose with this ability in longer fights, but when you invest into this ability, you can also have it apply powerful and shell thanks to the buff chain Pictos, and if you have the energizing buff Pictos, also restore up to 6 AP, and all of that to all allies with a 3 turn buff duration for free AP. Really good. So I'll put it into A tier. Good baseline power, cheap, scalable with Pictos, but there are other ways to get these buff chains going and you only need one way, so it may not be your first choice, but don't underestimate this basic looking skill, especially when you compare it to the next ability. All set, this applies Shell, Powerful and Rush to all allies, which may seem like a direct upgrade to the previous skill, but first off, it is quite expensive at 6 AP, which you may not always have. Second, just one of these buffs would be enough to get the whole buff chain going. Yes, it would require the Pictos, and I am aware you won't have them immediately, and maybe missing Lumina to enable buff chains, but my biggest issue with all set is that the buffs applied only last one turn. That's not great when you can get every buff for 3 turns with cheaper abilities if you invest some Lumina. So yeah, I do think all set is kinda bait once you know how you can get the buffs more effectively. It's not terrible. You could like use it every turn with energizing buff Pictos or something to restore AP and maintain the buffs or something. But there are better options in my opinion, especially for Sciel. So I'll put it into C tier. And then the final Sun ability is Fortune's Fury, which for 5 AP lets another ally deal double damage on the next turn. This is stupidly powerful and one of the reasons why Sciel is such an amazing support and kinda the strongest character, because at worst she adds as much power as your next best character thanks to Fortune's Fury, but she can't do much more because she doesn't have to waste it on setup turns. So most characters usually have these lower value turns where they just try to prepare their mechanic and their high payoff skills. And while Sciel also needs setup to deal high damage, she has other high value alternatives with buffs and things like Fortune's Fury. You could just alternate using the skill on your 2 other characters, making sure you hit them on their payoff turns, and that way alone you're already contributing almost twice as much damage as other characters. But while doing that, you are also generating Twilight charges with every skill use, which each add a 25% damage buff to your next Twilight state. So you can then go into Twilight state and now can have crazy damage potential yourself. So despite her mechanic being the slowest to get going, her having powerful options such as Fortune's Fury makes her a character that can always provide insane value to your team. Easy S tier, it should actually have its own tier above S tier. I'm not doing that, but it is quite far ahead. And that concludes solar abilities. Fortune's Fury is OP. Final Path is amazing for dealing damage yourself once you can afford its cost. And until then, Marking Card is nice for cheap marking utility, while Bad Omen or Searing Bond are nice AoE picks. And now onto her lunar abilities. The first lunar skill you have is Twilight Slash, a cheap payoff ability with a humble base damage of 1.4 that you can increase to around 5x if you consume 10 Foretell, which isn't really impressive, but if you can apply max Foretell in a 2-charge Twilight state and consume 20, you can get a 12.6 multiplier, which is quite a lot for a 2-cost starting ability, which is a nice example of how impactful the Twilight state with its extra Foretell stacks can be. But generally, you don't want to spend 20 Foretell and your Twilight state on a 2-cost ability because there are much harder hitting abilities. So C tier, it can be alright at the start of the game when you don't have another payoff skill, but should be replaced as soon as possible. Next up we have Firing Shadow, a 3-cost skill that deals around double base attack damage and can only consume up to 3 Foretell for double damage, which isn't great. If the damage of a single target payoff skill is barely higher than skills of the same costs that apply Foretell and hit in an area of effect, it's kinda not even worth using it. Not consuming all Foretell may seem nice, but generally the whole point is to consume all Foretell for a big payoff, which you just don't get here. So D tier, you don't really get anything out of this skill, and if you just need any lunar ability for the moon charge to get into Twilight state without consuming all Foretell, there are better options, like Sealed Fate. Sealed Fate hits up to 7 times and consumes 1 Foretell on each hit to deal triple damage, which made me believe it's a super high damage skill when I first saw it, and the original skill descriptions of medium didn't really help either. but the base damage is quite low at a 3.3x for all hits combined, and a triple damage Foretell multiplier is also not really that impressive compared to other skills that consume all Foretell for a bigger bonus. But not consuming all Foretell for a higher multiplier and potentially leaving most Foretell because critical hits will not consume any is exactly what gives the skill a unique function of a semi-payoff skill that leaves Foretell. With Foretell, it hits for around 10x attack power total, which is underwhelming if it costs you the Foretell, but quite good if your crit rate is high and you get to keep it. So basically the skill does what Firing Shadow fails to do. It's a decent damage filler lunar skill that leaves Foretell. The nice thing is also that you technically only need to have a single Foretell stacks on an enemy if your crit rate is high enough. And it being a 7-hit skill makes it especially strong when you're held back by the damage cap. I'll put it into B tier, a solid skill with a unique property that you may even want to keep late game, but Sciel has some crazy skills it has to compete with, and it's not going to keep up with the higher damage abilities. Like Phantom Blade, a breaking single hit skill, which means it has high break buildup, but will also be limited by the damage cap early on with its surprisingly high damage potential. Despite the humble 3.6 base damage multiplier, it gains 35% more damage per Foretell, so with just 10 Foretell, it hits for around 16x. But once you're in a basic Twilight state with 20 Foretell on an enemy, it will hit for 43x base attack damage, which was definitely surprising for me, given how this is a 5-cost break skill. She only has 2 break abilities and both deal really high damage now that I think about it. Anyway, A tier, high damage potential, high break buildup and the break capability on a 5-cost skill. It's really good. And then we have Delaying Slash, another ability that can deal way more damage than you would think. Very similar to Phantom Blade, but slightly less base damage with a 3.3. and a lower Foretell multiplier, but it still goes up to almost 35x in Twilight at 20 Foretell, which is really good for a 5-cost utility skill. The utility of the skill is implied, and while it may feel inconsistent, because I think it only works if the enemy would take their turn right after Sciel, and it kind of depends on speed and things like that. I don't want to get into too much detail, but delaying an enemy turn can be pretty OP. Then your whole team just gets to play again, and you can definitely break the game with this. And it deals really good damage too. I'll put it into A tier because I don't think most players want to build around not having enemies ever act. And if you don't do that, it's still really good. But obviously you could put it into S tier for being able to break the game. Next up we have Twilight Dance, the most expensive lunar skill that deals single target damage and extends the duration of Twilight by 1 turn. It has a really high base damage of 7.8, and with its Foretell bonus and a 2-charge Twilight, it gets a multiplier of 70, which is a lot, more than a Virtuoso Stance Stendhal for reference. It does take more setup, but it does come with a big upside rather than having a downside, and Sciel can make good use of all the turns leading up to the skill. Amazing skill, among the highest damage abilities in the game, and a good reason to let Sciel be more than a support. S tier. And then we have Dark Wave, Sciel's lunar AoE skill, quite expensive at 7 AP, but it does deal good damage. It has the same multipliers as Twilight Dance, but around 40% less base damage, which is fair given that this is AoE and not as expensive. A tier, it does its job pretty well. It's also the only AoE skill that consumes Foretell, but it's not going to deal as much damage as, say, Twilight Dance or the next skill, which is Our Sacrifice, or should I say, Your Sacrifice, because this skill, to increase its damage, drains the health of all allies except for Sciel herself, which seems kind of like a jerk move. But the multiplier you can get is quite insane. Despite the skill's humble base damage of 2.8, the coerced health donation of your beloved allies boosts the damage by almost 300%. You can get another 30% per stack per Foretell, and if you include double Foretell and the 50% minimum damage bonus of Twilight, you can hit for almost 120 times attack power damage, almost double as much as Virtuoso Stendhal, more than a fully stacked Burning Canvas in Virtuoso Stance, or a maximum Lampmaster's Light with Almighty Mask. This is the highest damage skill in the game, only outdamaged by 2 gradient 3 attacks. And this skill only costs 4, but well, also most of your allies' life, which can be pricey for sure, but you can also build around it and turn it into an upside, just like with Mael's Last Chance. There are plenty of benefits to be had for being set to low life. There are also more skill synergies with skills like Monaco's Cultist Slashes or Verso's Berserk Slash that can become the highest damaging options at 1 HP. And even if you wouldn't want to leave them at 1 HP, you could just fully restore each character's health on their second cheater turn with Clair's life once you have this Lumina combo unlocked, so that you can re-sacrifice it again if you wanted to. So yeah, the highest ceiling damaging ability with a downside that can be either mitigated or turned into an upside with countless synergies and only costs 4. Deserves S tier, I would say, although it may not be something that you would want in every build. The potential is just too high. And then we have a couple of more utility-oriented lunar skills left. First off, Harvest, a 3-cost skill that deals cost-appropriate damage and heals CL for 40% as a baseline, with an additional 5% per Foretell consumed, which is honestly really good, especially early on, and I think it's best used without any Foretell stacks. A 40% baseline heal is pretty significant already, and the value per Foretell stack just isn't as good as when you're using it for damage. It's just not that big of an increase comparatively, but can come in handy in a clutch for sure. B tier, great early game ability, but pretty much outclassed by its bigger brother. Grim Harvest, which for 5 AP deals slightly more damage and heals your entire team for 30% plus 5 per Foretell consumed, which is absolutely amazing. Once again, best used without existing Foretell stacks in my opinion, still a good chunk of healing, and most importantly, triggers all the heal synergies that let you apply Rush, Shell, and Powerful while restoring AP with Energizing Pictos on top of its baseline heal while dealing some damage. If you don't disable your heals for the Inverted and Confident Pictos, this is absolutely amazing and can pretty much invalidate her pure buffing abilities. I'd say high A tier, super strong, but there are a couple of contenders with the same function as this ability, like Luna's Typhoon for example, while Ciel's S tier skills can do more powerful things that pretty much define your game plan. And then we have Plentiful Harvest, a skill that I honestly forgot even existed until I double checked all skills for this video, and I can see why. It deals below average damage for its cost and consumes Foretell to restore AP equal to the Foretell consumed. I don't think this is a good use for Foretell stacks. They are super valuable for multiplying your damage, which is also why I recommended not spending them on heals either. But the other Harvest skills have the upside of having decent baseline healing without any Foretell. This one needs Foretell to do anything, which means you can at best utilize this every second turn. Another thing is that Ciel's mechanic can already restore AP for herself equal to the amount of Foretell consumed, so the AP restoration may be redundant for herself. I just think there are more efficient ways to utilize Foretell or restore AP and use Ciel's turn in general, but I also know some players really like their AP battery skills, and I guess this can work fine before you unlock the Pictors for better setups, so I'll give it a C tier. And then we have Dark Cleansing, an interesting ability, but not for what it does, but rather what it doesn't do. First, let's cover what it does. For one, it removes negative status effects from an ally, which I don't think is all that useful, because status effects just aren't that prevalent in the game, and the ones that are truly detrimental usually appear within a specific area and have a better solution. Charm, for example, can absolutely destroy you, but it only appears in one area, in which you can also find a Picto that makes you immune to Charm. So I don't think you really need a cleanse type of effect in general. The other thing it does is spreading buffs from one ally to others, which I also don't think is all that useful, because first of all, it only seems to work on the generic buffs. So things like Fortune Fury that double the damage an ally deals for one turn cannot be propagated. There are also many ways of applying generic buffs to all of your allies, so spending a turn to spread buffs just isn't necessary and not a great use of a turn. So for the most part, this ability text does pretty much nothing, but the reason why I think this ability still can be useful is because while not doing anything, it also doesn't consume any AP, it doesn't consume any Foretell, despite being a lunar ability. And being a lunar ability, it means it still generates a lunar charge. For Sciel, it's pretty much always better to use any ability over a base attack or an item just to advance her mechanic, and when you're limited by AP, spending a turn just to gain a moon charge can still be a decent option. If you start with a moon charge and then use a solar skill that applies Foretell, you can get a huge AP boost right as you enter Twilight to make the best of it, and you maintain the Foretell applied. Since Sciel's mechanic is the only one that can generate huge amounts of AP, it can definitely be worth it to plan ahead, and Dark Cleansing may be more valuable than you think, just for not costing anything, at least in the early game. Sometimes you may also be able to get a tiny benefit from the cleansing or spreading buffs, but in my opinion that's just a bonus. I'll put it into C tier. Despite the maybe not too obvious upsides, I still think it remains a low impact ability, and there's a much better way to build your moon charges without consuming Foretell, like with Intervention. Intervention costs 5, restores 4 AP to an ally and lets them play immediately. At worst, this is paying for itself in both a turn and the AP it costs, because the extra turn start also replenishes 1 AP, so already we are at least progressing Sciel's mechanic without really spending a turn. But there's much more. First, with Energy Master, you can make this a net positive when it comes to AP. With Cheater or the Baby Cheater, that cuts your damage in half for letting you play twice, you can take one turn yourself and then give your second turn to another ally who can deal full damage, and if they have Cheater, actually also take 2 full turns. Intervention, just like Fortune's Fury, raises the floor of Sciel's turn's value to be at least as high as your next best character. Even better because you can simultaneously funnel AP into a different character to enable their strongest attacks, and you could have used your first turn to also double their damage with Fortune's Fury. Not only are your turns super valuable because at worst you're just doubling another character's effectiveness, but you're also progressing Sciel's Twilight mechanic, in which she can deal stupid amounts of damage herself without wasting any turns with low value setup skills like most other characters have to. Having both Intervention and Fortune's Fury, as well as many other utility abilities that can heal and buff your entire team, gives this character so much flexibility and power. I would say Intervention in particular is objectively the most broken ability in the game, and the Cheater interaction further widens the gap by also being able to turn 1 turn into 2. Easy S tier at the very top, even better than Fortune Fury, a major reason why I would consider Sciel to be the strongest character in the game. Overall, these 2 abilities alone enable a full support playstyle for Sciel. And then she has even more options like Grim Harvest to heal all allies and apply team-wide buffs. But on top of that, she also has amazing damaging abilities. And keep in mind that she technically has infinite damage scaling with her mechanic. So if you want to embrace her Twilight nature, you could support your team until you hit Twilight state, and then consider going for a big payoff turn yourself with something like Twilight Dance or even our Sacrifice to throw your allies under the bus and show them what the highest damage potential can look like. Sciel is an amazing character with many great options for a variety of playstyles. I really recommend trying out multiple skills and try to resist the urge of only using Fortune's Favor and Intervention. I hope this video gave you a better idea of the value of her different skills. Let me know what you think, and if you liked the video, make sure to check out the other characters.